Hello and welcome to the Stone Church Bible Study. Today we will continue our look at the story of the flood, or as I'm going to be calling it, the recreation story. The reason I call it that will be made clear later on. I think a key word in today's Bible study is the word covenant. And when you think of the word covenant, maybe you think of a solemn commitment. What is the solemn commitment that God makes to creation? That's a really important question because really this sets the stage for the rest of the biblical story as it unfolds. So I'm really excited about taking a look at this passage of scripture. It's from Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 to 17. If this content has been a blessing to you, then please do leave a like. And for more from Stone Church, please subscribe. So I'm just going to reread verses 1 to 3, chapter 9, verses 1 to 3. And this is the translation that I'm using, incidentally, is the NIV here. So this may or may not jive with whatever English translation you have. So Genesis 9, verses 1 to 3. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky, on every creature that moves along the ground, and on all the fish in the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything." That line, "be fruitful and increase in number," it probably sounds familiar. And right away in this story, you'll notice some clear similarities between the story of the flood and the story of creation from Genesis chapter 1. So if I could actually give this story of the flood a title, it wouldn't be the story of the flood, it wouldn't be the story of Noah and the ark, it would be the recreation story, because it's like a renewal or a recreation of the cosmos. It's like, in a sense, it's like a Genesis 1 all over again. So what's the first thing? Yeah, again, that God says to Noah and his family. The first thing he says is be fruitful and multiply. That's precisely the same command that he gave to the first human beings. Right? God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it." Now, I touched on this a few weeks ago, but I think one of the major ideas here is that it's a vital part of our humanity to be fruitful, and not just in the literal sense of having children, but to bring joy and beauty and life into the world. I'll put it this way: before God ever gives any rules or laws, the very first thing that he says to the human race is be fruitful. I think that's really interesting. So God says this to the first human beings in Genesis 1, and he also says it to Noah and his family, again suggesting that this is a recreation story. It also suggests that Noah and his family represent a fresh start, a new beginning for humanity. The Lord also says to Noah and his family, "The fear and dread of you will fall on all creatures, on all animals," essentially. So rewind back again to Genesis chapter 1. You'll remember that in that story, God gave humanity dominion over all the living creatures of the land, sea, and air. And of course, by dominion, it isn't meant some kind of tyrannical authoritarian rule. Human beings don't have the right to exploit animals and exploit the rest of creation. There's this sense of wise and loving stewardship, like we're wise and loving stewards of creation. Right? So human beings are given dominion over the animals. But you'll notice here that, the Lord says, "The fear and dread of all animals will fall on you." What is meant by that? Okay, so the answer could be this. Before the fall, human beings only had vegetation for food. So there's this line in Genesis chapter 1. It goes, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food." So it sounds as if in that Genesis story, in that original chapter 1 Genesis story, Human beings are supposed to have a plant-based diet. However, after the fall, God makes these, I'm going to call them gracious concessions. So one of these concessions is to give animals over to humans for their use. So remember that before the man and woman are given the boot, before they're forced to leave Eden, God gives them something. Do you remember what this is? From when we talked about it a few weeks ago? He clothes them with animal skins. Right. So you'll see this theme occurring again and again in Genesis and throughout the scriptures. Yes, God does punish sin, but there's also a demonstration of grace that comes with that. So yes, the man and the woman are given the boot, they're forced to leave the Garden of Eden, but they're clothed by God. Cain has to go into exile, but God will give him a mark to make sure that he isn't killed. And you see this gracious permission to use animals as food given here in Genesis chapter 9. It says, everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. So getting back to the question, why this line about the animals having fear and dread of human beings? Well, this is the answer. Human beings have now become an apex predator. And of course, it's just wild game is going to run from us. They're not going to run towards our spears or guns or whatever, right? The fear and dread of humanity has come upon the animals. So there's this gracious permission for human beings to hunt animals, to use animals for hide and for meat. But there's one prohibition. It says, human beings cannot consume the blood of any animal. Or as it says in this scriptural passage, meat that has its lifeblood is forbidden from us. And, you might wonder, why is this a prohibition? Like, it sounds strange to us to think, okay, why, if animal consumption is allowed, why is the consumption of blood, at least in this verse, prohibited? And this is my guess. Blood and life go hand in hand. God is Lord and sovereign of all life, and for that reason, according to the ancient mind, God is also Lord and sovereign of all blood as well. So consuming blood then is to seize something that only God has the rights to. So yeah, we have permission to use animals for food, but we cannot somehow seize the life force for ourselves. And this prohibition is later restated. So in Torah, in the Jewish law, it says, but be sure you do not eat the blood, because the blood is the life, and you must not eat the life with the meat. So today, if you go to a Jewish kosher restaurant, I don't know if you've ever been to a kosher restaurant. There's certainly none in St. John as far as I know. But if you go to a kosher restaurant, you can be assured that if you eat meat there, the animal that the meat came from would have been slaughtered in a way that's in accordance with Jewish law, and that would involve some kind of draining of the blood from the animal. I'm going to include a quote from John H. Walton. He's an Old Testament professor. And he says, ritually speaking, the draining of the blood before eating the meat was a way of returning the life force of the animal to God who gave it life. This offers recognition that they have taken the life with permission and are partaking of God's bounty as his guests. So this reminds me of just the whole idea of saying grace before a meal. It's acknowledging that, the food sustains our life, and it's recognizing that all life comes from God. God has provided this food for us. God is feeding us. God has even just empowered us to live, right? So it's a way of returning thanks to God. Okay. Then it continues on, Genesis chapter 9, verses 5 to 7. This is again God speaking to Noah and his family. For your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal. And from each human being, too, I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind. As for you, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply on the earth and increase upon it. So human beings have the right to take animal life, but they don't have permission to take human life. The shedding of human blood is prohibited. And the reason is given here. It says that human beings have been created in God's image. And this is something that was established way back in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. And now it's restated here. So again, remember that the flood story runs parallel to the creation story. Now, however, in chapter 9, we are clearly told what this implies, this whole idea of human beings being uniquely in God's image. If human beings are created in God's image, then human life cannot be arbitrarily taken. If you strike at a human life, it's like striking at God himself. To kill a human being is like, in a sense, like killing God himself, in a manner of speaking. So Genesis chapter 9 affirms the sanctity of human life, that human life is precious in the eyes of God, and it cannot simply be arbitrarily snuffed out by another human being. So moving on, Genesis 9, verses 8 to 11. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "Now I establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, all those that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth. I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood to destroy the earth." I think this is really the heart of the passage of Scripture that we're looking at today. The major themes are spelled out here, starting with the whole idea of covenant. This is the first time covenant is mentioned in the entire Bible, and it's such an important biblical idea. So a covenant basically is like a contract. That's the best modern equivalent I can think of. And it's a formal agreement between two parties that spells out mutual obligations. And so God makes a covenant in these verses. However, this covenant does not seem to have mutual obligations. So it's more like God is making a solemn vow. God is unilaterally making this vow to all of creation. It seems like God will remain true to this vow, even if human beings are wildly disobedient. In fact, the Lord even says as much. Genesis chapter 8, verse 21. It says, "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done." So that's the substance of the covenant, isn't it? That's at the heart of the covenant. Never again will God allow chaos to overwhelm his good creation. And I want to make an important note here. It's not as if God is merely promising to abstain from destroying the world by means of flood alone. It's not as if God is leaving open the option of destroying the world by some other means, by fire or earthquake or plague or something like that, right? Remember that in the beginning of the whole story that we looked at a few weeks ago, at the beginning of Genesis, God called creation into being out of this watery abyss. What God is saying here in Genesis 9 is this: never again will I allow the watery abyss, so in other words, the forces of chaos, to sort of consume my good ordered world again. Never again. And I think the whole story of Noah and the flood has been building up to this particular point. So it started with this expression of the total corruption of humankind. That's what I mean when I say that the flood story is pretty dark. It paints a really dark picture of human beings and our character. Also, the next part, major arc of the story, is God's heartache over the fact that human beings have gone so wrong, that we're so messed up. Part 3 is the resolution to act on that heartache by executing his wrath, right, by sending the flood. But the hopeful part of the whole story is this: God's resolution to never again allow the forces of chaos to overwhelm his good order. And from that point, from this starting point here, this resolution never again to destroy, the rest of the Bible story unfolds. So the story of the Bible, the story of God's relationships with human beings, which is essentially what the Bible is, right? The story unfolds towards not the destruction of God's good creation. God has closed the door to that possibility. The biblical story is unfolding towards the healing and the restoration and the redemption of creation. And I think that's so important, because one major misunderstanding that a lot of people have about the Bible and about the Christian story in general, they have in their head this notion that it's all going to end with God blowing everything up and just destroying everything. But that's not scriptural. It's not, I think it's really theologically problematic. I think the overwhelming thrust of the Bible story is this: the ultimate restoration and healing and renewal of creation. You understand? That's so important, because, that story has hope at the end. There's not much hope in everything being obliterated, right? No. It reminds me of a famous verse from the book of the prophet Jeremiah. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." So in that particular verse from Jeremiah, God is specifically addressing the Jews, but I think that verse could equally apply to all human beings. "I have plans for you, plans to prosper you and not harm you." This is God's will, his intention for the entire world he's created. And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth." So God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant I have established between me and all life on the earth." As I said earlier, Genesis, of course, is a book about origins, and drawing from ancient Jewish folklore, it explains basically why things are the way they are. So earlier we learned about why men must work the land for food, why women have pain in childbirth. And here we hear about the origins of the rainbow, right? So the rainbow, in short, is placed by God in the sky. It's a sign of a covenant that God makes with all creation. And obviously a rainbow appears when the sun emerges, and its timely appearance after a rainstorm serves, I guess you could say, as a reminder. As bad as the rainstorm may have been, God will never destroy the earth by flood ever again. A bow, of course, is a weapon of war. You could see it as a weapon for hunting as well. It's been designed to take life. A bow is there to kill, bow and arrow, right? But here we see God taking his bow and he's hanging it up in the heavens. Now, what does that suggest? Well, it suggests that God is no longer against the world that he has fashioned. He's resting from the battle. He's putting his weapon aside. Notice once again, all throughout this story, these parallels with Genesis chapter 1 and 2. So you remember back in the creation story, on the seventh day, God rested. And here, at the end of the recreation story, or the story of Noah, we see God resting again. He's taking the bow and he's resting it in the skies, and he's ceasing from his, I guess, frankly, destruction of the world, right? The flood is now over, and so we're looking towards a new and brighter future. It says literally that God puts the rainbow in the sky as a personal reminder, okay? Now, it could function as a reminder for us, certainly, when we see a rainbow, of the significance of it. But of course, God has no memory in the same sense that human beings do. He doesn't forget in the same way that we forget. So why does this text say that God will use the rainbow as a reminder? Well, I think this verse clearly expresses God's fidelity to his covenant promise. You can almost see the rainbow as like God's signature written right into the skies. And once committed to the well-being of the world he's created, God is not going to back down. He's not going to renege on that contract. He signed it. He sealed it. God has good intentions for creation. His will is not to destroy it. Again, such an old story, one that we've probably heard about 1 million times. But it's good, I think, to look at it again from a different perspective.